almost none of them really advocate for Stalinism, or they're not explicitly tankies, but a lot of what they suggest would require that, and they're just unaware of it. Um,
Yeah, that's because leftists are not they're not that smart. They think they are, but they're not. Like they read, oh, I read Paracon.
mhm.
You really okay with everyone in your town knowing that you want like a dragon dildo? No, okay. So, the topic of this discussion is probably going to be economic systems, stuff like that. And because nobody knows, most people at least have some idea what capitalism is, at least some vague idea, but nobody knows what socialism is. I feel like it would behoove us if I defined what socialism means to me, because um, obviously I'm taking that position. It would make sense.
Mhm.
So when I say that I am a socialist, I mean that I'm a socialist in the original sense of the word. So I'm almost like a Ricardian socialist, if you know what that means. It means that I believe in the labor theory of value. That's something we can get on later. But I believe in the labor theory of value, and I believe that capitalists steal from workers. And I believe that fundamentally this is an unjustified relationship, and that we should have a market economy, a free market economy, but without capitalistic domination and exploitation. Um, a very simple way of looking at this is, in capitalism, the state sides with capital over labor. And in socialism, my conception of socialism, the state merely sides with labor, the majority, over management or capital ownership in some abstract sense. Right? Does that make sense?
Mhm. And yeah, I pretty much agree that socialists subscribe to this goal of having of getting rid of this relationship between capital ownership and the worker. But I work off the definition capitalism is economic system based on private ownership, and socialism is basically uh, collective ownership, but essentially state ownership of the means of production or state control of the economy. Um, and I argue a lot with anarcho communists,
Oh
and
yeah, those people are silly.
yeah, so I don't see how there's any way to have a socialist system without a state, because otherwise, how are you going to ban capital ownership and usage, essentially?
No, I
And
get what you're saying, but I would also say that I don't think you can have private ownership without a state either. I don't think you can have no state. I think that
yeah,
all rights are predicated on a state. And so any system that we live in ultimately was created by the state, right?
yeah, I'm like on the fence on that. I think there's some promise in anarchy, but I'm not totally
Hmm.
convinced. So I'm like
I
minarchist.
think it's feasible. I think anarchism is feasible. I don't think that it achieves the goals that it sets out to achieve. I think that any type of like the result of any type of anarchism would just be some form of state that just doesn't do what they want it to do. All right, but that's a whole nother topic. I can kind of explain why I take the position that I do about private property and stuff like that. I mean, first of all, you mentioned social ownership of the means of production, or a type of collective ownership directly by every person of means
Mm-hmm.
of production. This has many problems with it. First of all, anything can be a means of production, right? And capitalists will be the first to point that out, and I will be the first to agree. So you can't really meaningfully distinguish between someone's personal property and private property using that definition.
Mm-hmm.
Also, this type of private ownership that you mentioned that you're in support of, I conceptualize private ownership as simply what I described earlier, which would be the state siding with capital over labor, right? So I think my definition did cover that. And also, I addressed my position on collective ownership. I don't support it. I support a type of personal ownership, a type of direct personal ownership of individual means of production. So the state wouldn't have any say in, what you do with your property. Your neighbor wouldn't have any say to do, over what you do with even your production or any association that you freely form. Merely, merely you couldn't use your ownership of property to dominate others in a way, right? I would say something like your right to own property and use property for things ends when someone else begins, is kind of how I conceptualize that. So if somebody else is now by some necessity involved in your property, by some necessity, they couldn't have, chosen to do it, um, then you no longer have a right to tell them what to do because of that, because that's a type of coercion, right?
Yeah, and I fundamentally I'm a voluntarist, so I base my principle is every interaction should be voluntary at least. Uh, I mean, there might be some necessary evils. Like I think the state is fundamentally an evil.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a necessary evil. Taxation is theft, but you might have some justifications for that theft. Just like stealing some bread might be justified. It's still theft, but if you're starving, it is justified. Um, so, and just for some context, I used to be like a big anti-capitalist because I saw it as exploitation. Um, I went like full communist, realized that that's
Mm.
basically violence and coercion itself. And I kind of went full circle and uh, got into like some libertarian anarchist stuff. And that's kind of how I became like focused on voluntarism because I realized that was fundamentally what I cared about in the first place. So going into communism is like I wanted everything to be voluntary. I didn't want any coercion or exploitation. Um, and then I guess the point where I flipped on capitalism being exploitative is property rights. So
Mm.
like I agree so your right to property ends when it uh, basically forces someone else to interact with it. Like so I would say pollution
Mm.
is a form of aggression. And so that's involuntary and unethical. Um, so where was I going with this? So the ownership of capital I don't see as inherently exploitative because that person has a right to that capital and is entitled to use it however they want.
Well, if
And
they bought it, then they have the right to own it.
yeah,
They can, they can, like, I don't know, do whatever they want with it. They could, store, like, I don't know, their feces in it. It's their property. I don't care. As long as it isn't affecting other people through some means, then they're allowed to own it. My problem comes when we allow through the state the right of someone with means of production, which is again just any personal property that has productive capacity, to use the fact that they own that means of production to place themselves over others. Because fundamentally, I see production, the production of goods and services and all of these things, as not something that we choose to do as a society. The choice is either, no matter how you cut it, no matter how you divide the pie, um, you produce or people die. That's always the choice. And so no one freely actually engages in any type of contract with production. And so for you to merely own means of production and use it for your own personal use, I think that's justified as long as you've paid for it. But as soon as you use that ownership, maybe I'm repeating myself, to place yourself above another via the necessity of others to produce, I think that that's unjustified. And basically, you could say, well, what if a bunch of people just own all the means of production, and they won't like give it away to people so they can produce? Well, we understand economically they would want to give it away, right? Because they could sell it for money or something, right? And it would eventually would reach some type of balance where production would be something that people freely associate into. And if somebody owned like if somebody somehow became like the owner of like 12 factories, like what good is the 12 factories to them as a person? They'll just sell off the other factories to people who will use them in a non-exploitative manner, in my conception. And so that's kind of where I come at it logically, if
Mm.
that makes sense.
So, do you have a problem with the concept of like renting out a property you own?
Yes,
Okay. Why?
it's a it's a very similar thing. It's because fundamentally you're using your ownership of property to control someone in a very direct way. So the way that I distinguish this from, say, withholding, um, let's say that you own a Game Boy. We're in 1990s now, whatever. You own a Game Boy. Someone else wants that Game Boy. Oh, you're affecting them. You're dominating them. No, because that's not a direct personal control over someone. Their person is not directly under your control. Merely their access to a Game Boy is what's controlled by you. And I would say that in some cases this can be exploitive and like aggressive and non-voluntary. For example, we could talk about healthcare or stuff like that, but that's another conversation. I'm sure we can think of other scenarios where withholding things from people is coercive.
Mm.
But the broader point is that when someone is actually, by necessity of their comfort of life, their general welfare, to make dealings with you so that they are within your property wholly, their whole person is now controlled by you. So when a person is engaging in a labor contract in capitalism, they, by necessity of production, must associate within the property of another, the shareholders, and then they exert total control over their individual person. Likewise, with rent, when one is in the rented property that they're constantly paying out. That's the other thing. It's an infinite paying for a finite purchase of things. But that's another topic. But let's just say that they're on the property. Their whole person is controlled. They're not just being controlled through the withholding of a certain thing from them, right?
Yeah, but wouldn't that be the same if you just go over to someone's house and they have rules that you have to engage in? And I don't see it as more exploitative if you're getting paid to use that property versus if you're just on private property and you're not uh, being paid to do anything. You're still uh, engaging. You're still, in order for it to be a voluntary interaction, you still have to obey the rules of that property owner.
Well, when you're going over to your friend's house, there's no money exchange there. That's not a monetary, productive thing. Whereas in
Hmm.
capitalism, renting is seen as a productive thing, even though it doesn't produce any value, right? It's seen as something that produces money, wealth, but for nothing. There's no thing being produced by that. And so you just going over to your friend's house, and let's say that you invite like your 10 friends over for your birthday party. It's not the same type of relationship as uh, the landlord and tenant relationship. Fundamentally, I draw these lines because, I mean, it would be radical for me to say, oh, you invite 10 people over to your birthday party. They don't like your rules for your birthday party and they vote you out of your own home. So I draw the line at um, profit from exchange of use without exchange of ownership, right? That's not allowed. But just simply associating on your property you are allowed to set rules, because I think that properties actually has a lot of utility. If we just did away with property altogether, I don't think people would be that happy. Just generally because we like having that security in the things that we own, right?
Hmm. Yeah, but I think everyone profits off of it. You get a house and a place to live, and they get money. So, in every
Yeah, that's
exchange, you're agreeing that you wouldn't make the exchange unless you felt like you were getting more out of the exchange than what you were putting into it.
I can see in some circumstances someone, let's say in capitalism, let's say we have someone who gets a lot of money from like a side job or something, and they decide to go into business with someone or whatever have you. That's a free association because production is not a necessity for that given individual. But my broader point is that production socially is a necessity for everyone because um, the food that you eat, the house that you live in, all these things needed to be produced for you to purchase them, right? I think this is fundamentally something we can agree upon. But we're talking about specifically the renting scenario, and that obviously someone is getting uh, you would say, a better deal out of this. Well, the reason they're getting a better deal is because rented apartments are usually very small portions of land on property. And when you are a tenant in, let's say, an apartment, or let's say um, a half of a house, a room of a house, something like that, you're paying a portion of the property value and the value of upkeep for that property. So let's say it's like a little chunk like this. But you also are paying a little bit more than that for profit for the owner of the land, right? Or else they wouldn't do it. Now, obviously, in terms of buying an
Well,
actual house, to the average person without a house, this relationship is going to be beneficial because the initial payment every time, and even over maybe a few months, is not going to be as much as that. But if they actually were selling the room, if they were actually, instead of renting, selling the room, the actual upkeep of each tenant would be a lot less than that. So they're agreeing because, yeah, yes, they are agreeing because it is a better deal. I'm conceding that, but it is only um, the fact that they have to pay this extra amount, the fact that the relationship is controlling over them, is because of the property relation and because the property relation is recognized by the state. Does that make sense?
yeah, I just think that as long as you own it, you can make voluntary agreements with whatever stipulations someone wants to agree to use it. And so, like, I know that in various places that I've lived, I have cost the landlord money because repairs need to be made. I definitely did not pay that much money, but over time and over several different tenants, they can make money back on their investment. And so that's the entire
Yeah.
point. And I've been glad for that relationship. I didn't want to redo the bathroom or anything like that. I don't,
Yeah, but
but
there's nothing in nature that necessitates that relationship. Like that relationship, you may view it as fully voluntary, but it's only fully voluntary because the state recognizes a type of property and a type of use of property. If the state said, okay, we don't recognize this type of property, that type of relationship would go out of it would just
mm,
evaporate. It wouldn't exist anymore. And
yeah,
instead, your landlord would be maybe a manager, maybe some type of, you know, person that you decided would like manage finances for the hotel or the um the area that you're living in, the apartment complex, that sort of thing, right? I mean, there's yes, you voluntarily agreed to this relationship, and the same is also true in capitalism. You made the choice, you agreed to do the work for the wage, but you only made that choice because of a necessity of nature. right? And that combined with property rights recognized by the state. If the state didn't exist, like, it's really up in the air whether or not we would even have these types of relationships. Like, if the state didn't exist, maybe we would have some alternative arbitration court that recognized socialist property as an alternative. Or maybe we would have, in a worst case scenario, some arbitration court that recognized slavery. All these other things that we both object to. So I think that that fundamentally is just defined by what power structure you live under. And I think that if we look at it from a view of maximization of subjective wills, which I think would be more important for me, and I know about a little bit about your moral system, is also something you value as well. Clearly, a system where in all associations, or at least in most associations, we are all having a say in those associations, especially associations of necessity, is one where more wills are maximized, right? And so I think that there would be an incentive morally for these systems over capitalistic systems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of just ignoring the legality of it and just going based on the moral principle. Um, so so I don't think that yet like food and shelter at the very least are like necessities for life. But I don't I think so I go back to like the fundamental reason why we trade food and shelter, and that's because we don't want to do it ourselves. So and there are I think we're kind of addicted to this system. So there's not really the infrastructure or the knowledge to go out and live off the land. Um, but I don't think that fundamentally changes like your entitlement to things. So I think you're entitled to your labor and your person and the things you trade for. And so
I agree.
I think that basically we buy food and shelter from each other for convenience because it's just nicer than living off of the land as like a caveman. So,
Well, yeah, we purchase things. I'm recognizing that. That's a
mhm.
total recognition in everything that I've said. But in order to get the food, we have to make the, sofa, the piece of art, the machine of leisure, and we need to give that in the form of a barter or a trade to the person who is baking the food, who is making the shelter and all that stuff. All right, and that's just a trade economy. But we can't say that, oh, well, any this production was just a choice we made, because no matter how you split it, like, someone had to make the food. And if no one made the food, then eh, everyone would die. You could have like you could have a social welfare state. You could have social democracy. And if people don't work to produce, the state makes no money through taxes, and nobody gets food, and everyone dies. Right? It's not really something that you can't really split it. Like, you don't choose to produce. It's not a free choice in any system. But I think you're kind of in agreement with that. I think the disconnect is kind of like, you don't understand exactly like why I would be like objecting to these different relationships. You maybe think like, well, if people want to do it, why object to it? Maybe that type of attitude is that. Um,
Well, it's just like if I traded for the house, I can make whatever agreements I want with it, and
well,
yeah,
you
it
still
it
could do
sucks.
that in my
Like
system.
I would rather just pay $500 and own the apartment. That you
In
know.
my system, you could role play as a tenant and have your friend be a landlord, and then you just like pay them more than what you need to.
Hmm.
And it's a free association. You both agree to it, you both do it, right? The only
Yeah,
difference is that the state is not enforcing the relationship. It's not
yeah,
sitting there and
and
saying, this is yours, and by the power invested in this person, by me, the state, you have to pay this extra amount.
yeah, and I'm totally for people like in capitalism and private property ownership, you can go and share ownership of all your means of production with whoever you want. And so I totally support that, and I support co-ops if that's what people want to do. And I actually, like, I've maintained a lot of my values. So I would rather have like small local cooperative companies than large mega corporations. Like, I think corporations are
Mm.
basically arms of the state and
Yeah,
kind of pseudo
corporations are
fascist.
created by the state as well.
Yeah.
They wouldn't exist in anarcho-capitalism, They just wouldn't exist.
Yeah, and
Um,
even in like minarchism, they would be
well,
very
I don't
kneecapped at
know about
least.
that. I think even in minarchism, I think it would be kind of difficult to, because I feel like the productive forces of capitalism would have such a hold on the state that it would probably reinvent the corporation, the what's it like the different registrations of state recognized corporations. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would probably eventually corrupt and go back to the way things were. Um,
Yeah, so why not embrace the concept of like liberty and say these powerful institutions that generate these huge power structures, I mean, recognize that they're incompatible with a type of libertarian uh, ethic. It's not compatible with. Well, I mean, it could be like theoretically compatible, but it's not in actual practice compatible with like the idea of an emancipated society. Um, to have these large institutions, even in anarcho-capitalism, these large exploitative institutions provide you with laws. And so if you're paying someone to get law and order, and then if you don't pay them, then you don't get law and order. You get the chaos of someone killing you and no retribution or no prevention from that. Then that's kind of like a state. But it's a worse state because you don't even get to choose who it is who's making the rules that you're receiving, and you have to pay taxes as well for that. And those taxes are exploited from you by the natural monopoly of law, and all of that stuff.
yeah, I
Right.
think corporations are antithetical to liberty because of their relationship to the state, and basically they're indistinguishable from the state in a lot of ways. And it's not 100% in America, but it's, I would say it's kind of pseudo fascist because, but there is still
Hmm.
some separation of corporation and state. Uh, so, but I mean, full on like authoritarian socialism is complete marriage of corporation and state. It's just the same thing.
Well,
And
I mean, fascism is the marriage directly of
mm-hmm,
of corporations and state. I mean,
yeah,
it's they write about it. They love to tell you about it all the time.
mm-hmm,
Specifically me because I'm like, oh, I'm a socialist, and like, did you know that in Mussolini's Italy, the state sided with labor over capital 80% of the time? I'm not interested, dude. Okay, it's a total construct created by the state. It's literally the third estate, like the estates general. Like the capital gets one vote, the state gets one vote, and then everybody else gets another vote. It's silly. Um, but
yeah,
I think we can agree with that. I don't um, like Leninism, vanguardism. I think is scientifically demonstrated to be immoral, um, because you can look at historical progress, you can look at the regression of moral progress in the Soviet Union or China, and you can say, well, clearly they didn't do something right because according to everything that they said, they should be getting more social progress, more moral progress. So clearly they failed. That sort of stuff, right? But I think you can clearly see that I'm not advocating for anything of that sort. I'm not even like having some visceral anger towards um, like somebody agreeing to, pay someone extra of what they make. It's just a free association. If you and your friends want to get together and you want to, have your one friend be your boss, and you want to have him pay you in wages, pretend wages or whatever, and you want to work for him and you want it to be permanent, as long as everyone agrees, it's totally fine. And I'm totally cool with that. I'm just against the power of the state saying that, oh, we're going to protect this over other systems. We're going to protect this relation, and make it involuntary based off of the coercion of need of production and other such things, right?
Yeah, I mean, I want the state involved in as little as possible. Um,
No, I agree. I agree.
but I think if there's any role to it, it would be to protect people's entitlements to property.
I
Um,
agree as well. I believe that there are certain entitlements to property.
mm-hmm.
If you purchase something, that's yours. Like, it doesn't matter how big it is. If you purchase a space shuttle, if the person who made that sold that to you and you paid them and they got that money and you got your space shuttle and you're all happy and you made your voluntary transaction, that's your space shuttle. Now, how you use it, that's the important thing, because you can go out and you can buy a gun, but how you use that gun determines whether or not you get to keep that gun. If you go around shooting at people, or, like indiscriminately shooting at buildings or something, then you've lost the right to have that gun. And you have to ask yourself why. Why do people lose the right to have that gun when they do that? Well, it's because they made their property everybody's problem, right? They made their ownership of something everybody's issue and affect everyone. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's why we would do that. And I'm merely taking that principle and rationally concluding that maybe some of these things that we have in society aren't really in line with these ideas, And I'm sorry if I like to ramble sometimes, but in 2016, 2017, I was an Ancap. I don't know if you kind of picked up on that, but I was like a full on Ancap. And eventually I just realized that, in 2018, I realized that, my caricature understanding of what socialism was not what all socialists wanted. It was not like the original idea. If you look at Pierre Joseph Proudhon, or like, Ricardo or something like that, um, and I realized that there were other options. Other options for how you could have property, how you could, think of liberty and think of all of these important concepts. And my old ANCAP ideas just didn't make sense to me anymore. They just didn't work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a lot of them. Uh, they all kind of have different ideas, but
Mm-hmm.
none of them. Well, some of them are like Stalinists, but the main problem I have is like almost none of them really advocate for Stalinism, or they're not explicitly tankies, but a lot of what they suggest would require that, and they're just unaware of it. Um,
Yeah, that's because leftists are, they're not that smart. They think they are, but they're not. Like, they read, oh, I read Paracon.
mm-hmm.
You really okay with everyone in your town knowing that you want like a dragon dildo? No, okay, it's absurd. Um, that sort of thing.
mm-hmm.
Also, I don't think that, planned economies are not significantly morally superior to, market economies, because um, and they're also like, a form of alienation, right? Because you're replacing, economic alienation in the workplace with political alienation in distribution centers, right? And
Yeah,
the workers don't own their workplace anyways. They can't. I mean, like, if there's some distribution quota, like, how can they own the workplace? It doesn't even make any sense. They decide uh, they decide like how the roll call is conducted. Like, it doesn't
yeah,
doesn't make any sense. Like, there are There are films that talk about this in like Cuba, where like their workplace democracy is so pathetic. Like they just like vote on who reads the announcements. It's
Yeah,
like,
it
come on, that's nothing.
basically just lip
Uh,
service.
yeah, and it's because they want to say they want to say we reached this milestone, and that's all that the experiments did because they were idealists. They were utopian, even though they decried utopianism. They thought, oh, we need to abolish money. We need to uh, do this whole planning thing. It just isn't going to work. You can't abolish markets. You can't abolish property until we have post scarcity, because then owning things doesn't mean anything, right? Because everything's just a copy of something else. But until then, you can't have that society.
Hmm.
Um, is what basically me and my friends have agreed to.
Yeah. So I think what you said about like planned economies, I think that's one reason why corporations are so reliant on the state. Corporations are basically mini states and mini economies because they own
Mm.
like so many different enterprises in one body, and it essentially becomes a planned economy because there's no price negotiation really as a market between the different organs within a corporation. So they become reliant on state for basically to survive, and they become bloated and inefficient, and their profits go to places that are unnecessary. And so I don't really like corporations.
And when they fail, who bails them out?
Yep, the state.
It's the government.
It's
They don't
all
bail the people out, they bail the corporations out.
mm-hmm, too big to fail. Um,
Exactly.
but so
And that's another big thing I can hate on my comrades for, especially the Yugoslavian simps. Like they're like, oh, Yugoslavia, that's where market socialism happened, blah, blah, blah. If you look into it, it wasn't market socialism. It wasn't Ricardian socialism. It wasn't mutualism, any of these things. The state owned all the socially controlled means of productions. It's in their constitution. It said that. And they would never let any cooperative fail. And that's why they ended up going into so much debt,
mm,
because they just kept on having to prop up these cooperatives that were just producing things that no one wanted. You know, if no one's buying it, then why keep making it? You know.
yeah, and I do think market socialism obviously is vastly superior. I think there's an interesting idea in becoming reliant on a certain system where like you're kind of addicted to it, where we are addicted to this system of production. If we suddenly
Yeah.
changed it, we wouldn't know what to do. Everything would just stop. People would die. So I mean, there's obviously you have to change things a little bit gradually, but I guess the point is like what are your entitlements in a system where you're reliant upon it. So like if you buy that rocket ship and then you hire some people to maintain it, and I don't know if you're averse to like the buying of people's time or buying of their labor, but at, like at what
I
point are
view
they
that
like
one's labor is inherently tied to them. It's an extension of the person.
but at what
You
point
can't
are
you can't sell it.
you like responsible to like if someone's becomes reliant on that job, are you responsible to keep giving them that job, or are you just responsible as long as they show up? um
Well, that would just how it would work is that would just be the norm of how interactions occurred in production. Um, what would happen is you would own, say, a factory or say like a bunch of farmland or something, and you and your friends would get together and you would um, say, I agree right? Because you're the holder of the farmland. I agree that we're going to associate on this farmland, right? And by making that agreement, necessarily entailed in that agreement is that one's position of like setting rules for how it happens, one's total control of ownership of that land is now dependent upon the consent of everyone involved. And the way that that would manifest is not through any state coming down and saying, oh, everyone wants this guy to be in charge. No, 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 we don't like him. It would simply be that any time that the people involved in this association didn't like the management, didn't like who was at the top, the state would simply side with them and not with the owners of some abstract notion of property. Right. And so, necessarily, by agreeing to enter into that productive relationship, all parties would know what they're consenting to. It would be a norm in the society. You, as a property owner, an owner of productive property, know that when you associate with people, those people have you also give them ownership as well. Like that's just how the deal would occur in the society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a good contract to have with an employer. Um, I just don't think that that should be the only way that you should be able to contract labor. I think, you know, I would support a contract like that, but
No,
I would also
if you
support
wanted to,
people making other contracts like that. That's not a stipulation.
yeah, I mean, I agree as well. If you want to have a relationship that resembles like a capitalist relationship, as long as everyone continues to be happy with that relationship, it's fine. The difference is that there's no power of the state behind it. There's no hand of the state, fist of the state to say, oh, well, these people don't like what you're telling them to do. Well, screw them. They have no say. That doesn't exist, right? Instead, the fist of the state, the hand of the state, is always with the majority, right? Which you could say that's maybe tyrannical in some certain circumstances, but it certainly more gives more autonomy to more people than if the fist of the state was with the minority. And so I would simply say to sum up this concept, I guess that I'm expressing, is that in my system of market socialism, liberty, autonomy are innate to the person. Whereas in capitalism, liberty and autonomy are earned things, right? You earn your liberty. You buy a share. Um, you know, um, yeah, exactly. You buy share, right? You have to make that money and then purchase that share. Whereas in my system, you are guaranteed a share by the association necessarily, because your labor is inalienable to you as an extension of yourself.
Yeah, so I think the problem there is like if you've purchased something and then people can vote to take it away from you, then that's also alienation of labor,
Yeah, but
right?
you agree to do that.
Well,
You
but you
feel
have to agree to
consented
do
in that
that.
relationship.
But you would have to agree to do that in order to
Well, yeah,
associate
because
at all.
production's a necessity, right? So now you see the double-edged problem. The problem in one scenario is that since production is a necessity, the laborer must associate with the capital owner. But also in my system, since production is still a necessity, the the previous owner or the previous holder must yield their control to the laborers, right? The fundamental distinction that I'm making here, the line that I'm drawing, the side that I'm taking, is that I support whatever option here between these two is going to give the most people autonomy, is going to give the most people control. And fundamentally, clearly, it is the second option because at least in that option, people have some say necessarily, right? And I may be upsetting slightly, or maybe even majorly, depending on the person. the previous owner or the previous holder of absolute authority of the property. But I am also empowering more people. I am giving them autonomy. I'm giving them liberty. Whereas in the other situation, the majority is subservient to a minority necessarily. Right? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, I just think that's okay as long as it's your property. Um, but
Well, your property is decided, and what you can do with it is decided by the state.
mhm. But I think that the moral way to do things, like just putting aside legality, is if you own it, no one can tell you how you have to associate it with anyone. So I think that's the
Well, yeah,
fundamental disagreement.
I, I'm not telling the owner of capital, means of production, to give up their property to the laborers any more than in capitalism the state is telling the laborer to give up their autonomy to a capitalist by associating on their land, right? I think it goes both ways because production is a necessity. And so what you're coming back at me with is well, because production is a necessity, you're going to have to force these previous owners to engage in this relationship. Well, in capitalism, the laborer is forced into this relationship automatically, where they don't have any say at all. And so I'm merely making I'm taking the stand that I think more people having a say, more people having autonomy and dignity is a better system, and that's the stand that I take because of my principles.
Well, I'm not saying that you would force the capital owners into this relationship, but if they wanted to associate, they would be forced to associate in that democratic manner.
Um, I guess you can kind of say that it's restricting different modes of relationships, but fundamentally, I think that's no different from saying that in capitalism we restrict the mode of relationship of slave and master. Um, Not because I mean because these relationships are just defined with how the state recognizes property. That's the only real tangible difference between these different systems. In a slave society, we could construct a slave society where you engaged freely and traded yourself to someone else based on some kind of conceptualized choice that we make, even though there's no way that will be a voluntary interaction, right? We both agree with that. But once you do that, you could have the state then say, well, your property. So then the owner of you has the right to usus and usus fructus. So when you have kids, they're also your master's property, and et cetera, based off of purely voluntary interactions. We've recreated the slave relations of the economy. And if we're evaluating different economic systems based on how many different possible relationships we can engage in, the slave system is actually far more voluntary because the individual in that system could agree to become a slave. They could agree to become an employed laborer, or they could freely associate in some socialistic mode of production, right? If you see what I'm getting at here. But because the state recognizes particular ways of owning property and reifies certain modes of production that can exist or cannot exist, depending on some economic force. And because production is a necessity, necessarily there is like a level of coercion into these relationships, and it would be better, right? It would be better, or be a more free system if we said that this type of slavery were abolished, right? And by the same token, I would say it would be better if this type of relationship, the capitalist relationship, was in a sense abolished or just not recognized, right? Because that's how it would disintegrate.
Yeah, I mean with slavery, I mean you could enforce any legal concept, but uh, it's kind of a contradiction to voluntarily sell yourself into slavery because
What's
you,
contradictory about it?
well, you could just cancel the contract and then you no longer be a slave. So
Well,
it's
you
you're not
chose
really
to
property.
sell yourself into the slavery, and do you not own yourself? Can you not exchange yourself? I mean, you could exchange yourself, and then yourself is now alienated from yourself. It is now owned by someone else. And if the state recognizes that as property, that is the notion of property that prevails. You forfeited your say. Your say was to forfeit your say. I don't think it's
Um,
contradictory at all.
but you can't really give ownership of your body to someone else unless you're dead.
Well, you can't really give ownership of the product of your labor to someone else.
But why not though?
Yeah, why not? Well, I mean, like I could be an narco slave holderist, and I'd be like, well, why can't you sell yourself? Why can't someone own you?
Well,
You know,
so the product of labor is transferable. So,
ownership of oneself is transferable
but not really. Like you could have,
because
like
ownership is a state recognized concept.
you
It
can't
has no
really,
meaning without a power structure to enforce it.
yeah, but you can't really like put someone else's brain in your body.
Well, hold on. You don't want to appeal to occupation and use property, do you? Because you know that's the form of property that Proudhon uses, and he's a market socialist.
Yeah, but it's about
The laborers occupy and use the workplace,
mhm.
right? I mean, so property and ownership doesn't correlate in capitalism with occupation and use. It correlates with right of ownership, recognized by the state.
Yeah, so you have a right to your own body.
Because the state says so. The state could say, no, you don't. You can sell that.
Yeah, but I'm just talking morally, not legally.
Oh yeah, morally it's wrong.
Yeah.
Morally slavery is abhorrent and like way more evil than capitalism.
So like conceptually how you couldn't really ever give up ownership of your body. You could temporarily
Yeah.
agree I'm going to do what you say and like role play as a slave.
I'm not against that.
But it wouldn't be a voluntary association anymore if you decided, well, I don't like being a slave anymore
Yeah,
and they
you would
forced you to still
always
be a
have the
slave.
right to. But didn't you previously agree to them that you were their slave? Aren't you stealing from them by reasserting ownership of yourself? I mean, you and
Well,
I agree that you cannot be alienated from yourself because you occupy yourself, because you're in yourself. You can't sell yourself. It's just not something you do. And so, in all relationships, if you want to disassociate, the state is on your side, right? Because we've recognized that morally.
mhm.
I'm merely saying that the product of one's labor is, in a certain sense, inalienable from them. Why? Because it removes um, this construct that controls people, necessarily reducing the actualization of their wills. Right? That is the moral justification. That it reduces the actualization of subjective wills, the maximization of subjective wills, and therefore I must accept something like this position morally.
Well, then but then how would you trade something?
You would have it and then trade it for another person's product,
Like
right?
but then the product of their labor becomes your ownership,
Yeah,
right?
well, when you purchase what someone has produced, you are paying them directly for their labor. Whereas when you pay the capitalist, you're paying their workers as well, but also the capitalist who did not produce, right?
Well, they
And a portion of
produce
that you're
the
paying for the embodiment of the labor, but the embodiment of the labor value is split so that part of it goes to the capitalist arbitrarily because of their right of ownership as recognized by the state, and then the other
yeah.
portion goes in the form of wages to the workers. So their product of their labor is alienated from them. Like if we talk about the proverbial lemonade stand, it doesn't work because the kid at the lemonade stand is making lemonade. They're imbuing the lemonade with their labor. In a sense, in a Lockean sense, they're mixing it with their labor. And so when you pay for the glass of lemonade, you're directly paying for their labor and they get all of it. Whereas if there was some owner of the lemonade stand, let's just say we're role playing here, and it's just some like other kid who's just kind of standing there, and you pay them instead for the lemonade that the kid made. And then at the end of the day, the owner who was just standing there the whole time just kind of like decides how much the kid who's making lemonade gets, when all of it was made by them and none of it
Hmm.
was made by the other person, right? So
Yeah, but
capitalism necessarily detaches people from their labor.
um, I but at a scale like that, the kid can just decide to cut that person out and just make lemonade on their own. But like, so would you say,
Well, that no, they can't because they don't own the means of production. It's owned by the other kid.
um, okay,
They can't like
so
just say,
then
"I'm
the
taking this. This is mine now." That would be socialism if they did that.
so if he just so he's buying the lemonade from the kid. So like, so if I hand you like a rock and I pay you to carve it into a shape, and then the rock is mine at the beginning, and then the statue is mine at the end. Is that alienation of labor?
If wait, can you say that again?
So
The
if
the who
so,
owns the
like
rock?
I own the rock,
Okay,
the
you own the rock.
capitalist. Somehow I've acquired a rock, um, and I bring it to you, and I pay you whatever. It could be money, it could be apples, whatever, to carve it into like a little statue, and then the statue is mine at the end. Is that alienation of labor?
Um, Let me think about that. I don't really think so. Um, it would be if the owner of the rock was like if the owner of the rock was like putting it directly on the market and you had no say on like what the price of it was or anything like that, I would say it is, you know.
So you are saying that you have some kind of infinite ownership over that rock, even though you've been paid.
No, you only have ownership over um the embodiment of something that you produce. Like if I made like a paper airplane, right? I own that paper airplane, right? And I can sell it. I have the right to sell it. Now, if somebody purchased my paper airplane, right, which is I think what you're getting at, like if somebody purchased the paper airplane and then walked somewhere else and sold it to someone down the street for like a slightly larger amount, that's not the same because they're walking to that location is added labor, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah, so
because
it's
labor is just a labor theory of value is just the theory of the energy theory of value, and the energy theory of value is just any change, any positive change is an increase in value. So the fact that they're walking increase the value of it, um, uh, is them adding some labor to it.
yeah. I mean, I think that is true, but I think the labor theory of value is just incomplete because it doesn't account for, well, what if the person just doesn't care how much work you've put into it? Then it's worthless. But so I don't think it's flawed
Yeah,
in any
I
sense
mean
other than it's
that's
just incomplete.
okay. I mean, maybe we can agree with that. I mean, like the proverbial fruit in the Garden of Eden. The price of the fruit in the Garden of Eden is the labor necessary to pick it. But you're saying that the necessary thing before that is the desire for fruit. Just like that's true,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's like saying it's a, like how Marx says it's a necessary or like a socially necessary product.
Hmm.
Um, I guess it's a way to get around that. But
So
yeah,
like,
I think it's two true things about about reality, right?
yeah. So
I would
but
agree with that.
so like if so you're agreeing that it's okay if I take that statue that you've carved and I sell it in some way. It's fully
Yeah,
my property.
if I carve the statue, you purchase the statue, and then you find someone else who like really likes the statue, I think that's valid, right? Because that's just differences in people, and then the act of the one person like moving it or making it aware to the other person or something like that. It's a level at which I don't think anyone's affected by it, so I don't really
Yeah.
care about it that
So
much because
would you?
the end that I'm trying to achieve is a maximization of subjective wills. So like if by some means you can find a case where like someone is exploited, but like necessarily like they're not being affected personally at all, then I'm not going to care about that issue, right? I'm not going to
Mhm.
really consider it morally, yeah, just morally.
So would you kind of conceive the same as if you had the rock and you carved it and you sold that to me? Would that kind of be the same thing as if I had the rock, I paid you to carve it, and then I have the rock at the end?
First of all, there's a lot that's left out of that um, scenario because the capitalist isn't merely just paying for services.
Yeah.
I mean, in a
Well,
sense, they kind of are, but the other important aspect is the fact that the service that they're paying for is production, and it's not production um, simply for their own consumption. It's production for social consumption.
yeah.
But we can all we can hand wave all of that away. In any relationship, I think that it's not the same. I would say that it is fundamentally a different thing because production is a necessity, and therefore this relationship needs to be looked at with scrutiny, and the association must be ensured to be free amongst individuals. And I think it just behooves the state to recognize labor over capital.
So I think, I agree production is necessary, but each individual act of production is not. It's just like a collective build up, and demands end up getting met based on
Well, yeah,
people
because
seeking to profit
there's
off of that.
surplus.
Yeah.
That's because of surplus. Sometimes we do things we don't need,
Um,
right? We do that a lot.
but the what I'm kind of trying to build up to is like, so if it's okay for me to provide a stone and pay for the labor on the stone and then sell that stone, like at what scale does it become exploitative? Is it exploitative just on that, or is it exploitative if I pay that person every day, or is it exploitative if I pay 10 people to do that every day?
It's exploitative when you are owning means of production and you are using those means of production to have others produce with those means of production under your direct control. That is when I would object to it. If it's some other relationship other than that, I don't object to it, right? If it's
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm paying this guy to like carry my like suitcase, that's just a service. I don't have a problem with service jobs. Um, but if we're taking a person and we're putting them by the necessity of production in your property, and then because they're in your property producing, you exert control over them. I think that's the problem, right? That I'm objecting to, right? And I think we can logically define that as a distinct thing. right? We can
Well,
logically understand what that is, and there's no inconsistency problems with that.
but from my perspective, you're just exerting control over your property.
Well, yeah, that's your perspective naturally as a capitalist who recognizes that property is just some right granted by the state, and that's somehow like an objective thing. I think that right is entirely constructed by the state,
Because
right?
if
And if it behooves the populace, if it increases liberty that the state does not recognize that and instead recognizes labor, then I think it should, right? Because that's the better option. That's the more moral option.
well, I mean, I'm not concerned really with if the majority is happy based on violating an individual's right. Like, you kind of would you agree with that?
Well,
Like, if it made
it's your morality,
99%
not
of
the.
if it made 99% of people happy to torture a baby, like, or a small child,
That's
like,
clearly unjustified, but that's
yeah.
incomparable.
Well, the
It's
point is that
incomparable to a free association that someone knows that they're going into with society, where they're saying, okay, we're going to open up business, and they know that it's going to be a certain way because that's how we've decided property is. Right. It's
yeah.
entirely different from like the 99% voting to torture a baby. Okay. I don't believe that morality comes from democracy. I believe in one moral principle, and that is the maximization of the actualization of subjective wills. That's not democracy, right? In that situation, the baby getting tortured for no reason, that's bad because the baby is not actualizing their subjective will. They're being tortured. They're suffering.
hmm
Right? Does
Um,
that make sense?
yeah. The just I'm just trying to say that violation of individual rights, it wouldn't matter how many wills that satisfies, right?
Um, well, I mean, I can't think of a circumstance where like just arbitrarily like hurting someone for no reason, like don't know that's never justified by definition. But if somebody's increase in subjective will comes at the expense of others' maximization of subjective wills, well, then we can say, okay, well, there's maybe something we can do a little different here, maybe we
Mm.
can like because I'm not talking about, oh, let's just like purge all the capitalists, that's I'm not Mao here, okay? Like
Yeah.
they're gonna be alive, they're gonna be okay, they're gonna go on owning their property even. I'm not gonna like directly expropriate things from people even, well, although that might you know come from that might naturally be entailed at some point, but yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm merely placing the burden that was on labor on capital now. Labor, by the necessity of production, must associate with capital, right? You've already agreed with that. Now, what if we just say capital must associate in labor's terms? It's just all it is. And because labor is more people, that's more actualizations of subjective will. And the previous owners, they know what they're getting into. It's a voluntary choice, just like how the laborer interacted with the capital in capitalism. I don't see why anyone would object morally to it.
I just think that it already excuse me, it already is both because you negotiate from both sides for basically on an individual level. Like, if you hire someone, you're
It's not a
saying, well,
negotiation.
what can you give us and what can we give you?
It's not a negotiation if one side has guns from the state. It's not a negotiation if one side has the
Yeah,
fist of a tyrannical institution that like also bails them out. Like
but
if it's not.
that's why, because I don't see it as an exploitation unless you're forcing someone to work for you.
But I use the terms exploitation. I use the term you can't alienate someone from the product of their labor. But what I'm really saying is something very simple. I'm saying that because we recognize that production is a need, we recognize that the associations of production are inherently not voluntary to certain extents. And so, if we have some concept of ownership of capital that allows one person to control other people or allows the few to control the many, perhaps we should look into that and say, well, maybe the many should control the few in the way that the few controlled the many before. So if you're saying that the way that workers are being made by necessity of production to associate with capital, if you're saying that's fine, then what's your problem with me saying that by the necessity of production, capital must associate with labor on its terms?
Well, I just think it should be on a case by case basis. Like, so production is a necessity, but if you don't want to do it yourself, then I don't think it's necessary to cooperate with someone else. It just makes it more convenient.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there are a lot you can make more things if more people associate, so there'll probably be a natural economic incentivization to do that, right? But what exactly are you getting at? Like, I'm not going to like say that a capital owner must be forced by a gun to give over their land because their land must be used for the common good. I don't
Yeah.
believe that.
Yeah, I
I
understand
believe
that.
that they will naturally, by the way that the property norms of the society come about, they will just they will agree essentially just as much as the labor and capitalism agrees to associate with capital. They will just agree to associate with labor, and they will associate on labor's terms, meaning that in any dispute, instead of capital having the guns, labor has the guns.
Well, I would prefer neither side have a gun. Um,
Well, I
like
would
I,
prefer everyone be self-employed and just everyone own a little lemonade stand.
yeah. Um,
But that's not the reality of the situation.
well, I agree that those terms are should be the norm. I just don't think it should be enforced. Like, I think it would be great if workers could get rid of uh, the owner who's just hoarding all the wealth, uh, and is just like a shitty manager or whatever. Um, but I think that owner should have to agree to that first. And I think it should be an option that he doesn't have to. And but if that was a norm in society, people would pretty much just not sign contracts like that. I just think that it should be a voluntary choice, basically.
Well, in both situations, it's the same amount of voluntary, right? I've explained that like multiple ways. You know, the necessity of production, we agree. The fact that you think it's okay, it's voluntary. In fact, that laborers, given the fact that production is a need, are made to associate with capital on capital's term. I'm merely saying that that same force, the necessity of production, be instead of placing laborers into this relationship on capital's term, placing capital in this relationship freely, voluntarily, in the control on labor's terms, right? It's literally just the inverse, right? Same voluntary interactions, but just on the other side.
Yeah, I just don't see that labor is being forced to associate at all.
Well, then
It's
in my system, you will be forced to concede that capital isn't being forced at all as well.
um well, it's not being forced to enter the market, but it's the way that it can conduct itself in the market, I think, is what I'm objecting to.
But you agree that these norms maximize autonomy. They serve the maximization of subjective will. You agree that, and you also agree that it's just as voluntary as well. So I don't see. I mean, maybe you can say that. What principle are you appealing to then to say that um, this relationship is justified with the power of the state behind it?
Just voluntary association is just if
Well,
you
mine
want
is
to.
voluntary association too. It's
Well, but you're saying that um, I mean, you said you can voluntarily agree that to run it
Yeah, as
like
long as
that the
everyone agrees,
capitalists.
they can. Yeah,
But
if they
but
really
but
like
then
the
there's always
capitalist side.
the option of the workers invoking the state to remove the capitalist. So I just am
Yeah,
objecting to that part.
there's always a possibility in capitalism of the capitalist invoking the state to fire workers
Yeah, I
and
think
bring in strike breakers
if you're
and do all that stuff.
yeah, I think if you're unhappy with the association, you just leave the association. And that means I'm not going to pay
But the
you
association
anymore, or that means
owns the
I'm not
means
going to
of
work for you
production.
anymore.
But the association owns the means of production, and you've agreed that the owning the means of production is a need. It's you can't like at a certain level freely engage in production. You can't just choose, oh, I don't want to produce anymore. Like, I mean, the problem's kind of solved with social democracy, but that's like statism.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you would support that. So I'm giving you an option to have a free society without some kind of huge bureaucratic state. I mean, you could even be a mutualist. You could say that an arbitration court would sort this all out, a private arbitration court.
Yeah. Well, your system is definitely a lot better than uh, most socialists portray.
I try. I
Yeah.
really try.
It's because it is not a huge shift actually. Um, but I guess maybe I gotta go soon. But maybe we can leave it at there and then pick it up
Yeah.
at some other point after we both thought a little bit more.
Yeah, it's just stuff to think about.
Yeah.
It's always good to do that.
Yeah.
But always good talking to you. All that stuff.
Yeah. It's a good chat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
Peace.
I think I made a comment like on your channel about anarcho monarchy. And
Yeah, I thought I got that that was satire. Okay.
but kind of. I think it is actually a government whose only purpose is to prevent governments from forming. I think there's something there.
Hans Hermann Hoppe. Okay, I know where that comes from. Okay, but that's a whole other
There's
topic.
something there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Food for thought.
but I'll go.
All right,
Peace
man.
out. You
Well,
can do what
thanks
you're
for
doing.
coming, and I'll talk to you soon.
See ya.
Bye. Dog bless.